Today on Paul's Old Crap, we're going to do the recapping of both the analog board and the power supply unit for the Macintosh SE 30. Now, I don't expect any of these to really be leaking anything on the board, but I am performing this recap because I am experiencing video glitching, which is generally a symptom of failing components on the analog board. I've already recapped the logic board for the SE30, and it didn't solve this particular problem, so typically the analog board is the next thing to try and repair. Now, when it comes to the SE30, there's a couple different vendors who made the power supplies. This particular one is made by Sony, and I've got a parts list on my wiki, but before you order your own capacitors for your own computer, I'd recommend you pull the board out. So on the analog board here, the power supply actually bolts right to this board. So pull the analog board out of your SE30, and it'll say on the case for the power supply if it's made by Sony, if it's made by someone else. So if it's not a Sony unit, I recommend opening the whole thing up and checking the value of capacitors yourself. Also be warned that I don't know if there's a bunch of revisions of these power supplies, so the list that I made for this particular one might not cover all Sony power supplies. So that is something to be aware of. But I'm not expecting this job to be overly difficult. There's a couple things that you will need to know. That would be, well, one of these is this particular capacitor right here. This is a bipolar capacitor, and as far as I know, it's the only one of the aluminum capacitors that are like that on any of these components here. And this is actually the first bipolar aluminum capacitor I have come across on any of my recapping. Unfortunately, nobody makes this anymore. I've tried taking these values and looking them up on like DigiKey, Mauser. I even just searched eBay and the web in general. I found no vendor replacement for this capacitor. But in my search, I did come across a 68K MLA forum thread that said using one of these, like this film type capacitor, of the same value is pretty much the only way to get around the requirement of a bipolar capacitor here. Because on these film capacitors, these are also like there's no polarity or something like that. That's my understanding. So anyway, it was recommended that this capacitor be a replacement, and I think they actually provided the exact DigiKey part number, so I used that to make my order of this. So this capacitor I will be using for that spot right there. Now, the other thing to bring up, this large capacitor on the power supply, this is also no longer made. Now, I don't know how long these are generally going to last. I don't think I'm experiencing any problems with the power supply itself, but I did plan on recapping the whole thing just because I've already got the system in pieces. I don't want to have to do this again in the future. So this particular capacitor here, I couldn't find a replacement, and 68K MLA forums also said that for this capacitor, what should work is this one has a higher capacitor rating on there. So this one here is 680, whereas the one I'm replacing, there's a bunch of stuff in the way, I don't think you'll be able to see it. This is 620. So the thread indicates that the difference in the capacitor rating, the rest of the board should be okay with it. And I'm not going to find this out until I actually replace the capacitor and test it out myself. So yeah, it's just another one of those things where I would have preferred to use the original capacitor value, but I looked everywhere and it seems like just nobody makes these anymore. So if you want to replace this capacitor, yeah, you basically have to do this. So I am hoping this works out, and I may hang on to this one just in case anything goes wrong with the future use of this newer capacitor, but I don't know how long the rest of these capacitors are really expected to live, so I want to get the whole job done with all new capacitors. The only other types that I actually plan on replacing, oh, it's on the power supply as well. There's two film capacitors here. These are like, I'm assuming these are like the line input filter caps or something like that, because the rating on these, 0.22, these I've encountered on both the 2GS power supply and a recent power supply I just recapped, and I've got a few of these already on hand, so I figure I might as well just replace these at the same time. These aren't the kind I'm overly concerned about. It's the clear looking ones that I pointed out in my last video, but I do have spares of those, so I will be replacing those as well. Other than those problems, the rest of it should be straightforward. On the analog board, there is a bunch of glue that's pretty much on all of these components, which was a bit annoying, but yeah. Anyway, I think what we'll do is I will go ahead and start off with replacing the bipolar capacitor with the new one that we picked out. Alright, so I think we're ready to remove the capacitor. It is this one right there. So that would mean it's these two leads right in there. So just using the desolder braid stuff here. Just want to make sure this gets nice and clean. Alright, I think that is probably enough. So we'll flip this over. And I tried to kind of get some of this glue out of the way with my knife, but yeah, let's see how easily this comes off. Okay, that wasn't too bad. And if I take a look, let's see, bottom of the capacitor, I'm not seeing any signs of leakage, so at least that's good. Probably in for a fairly clean recap, I think, for most of these components. And if we take a look at the actual board, the board itself does look nice and clean, with the exception of all this stupid glue, but we're just going to leave that as is. Now, with this new capacitor, because obviously this is not even remotely close to the same type, if we line up, come on. This is really not going to work out as well as I kind of thought it might. It's a fairly wide capacitor, so these legs are not really liking the angle this is going in at. Unfortunately, this is probably, whoops. Well, it's pretty close to the base of the board here. The legs are bent and crazy angles in there. Might be hard to see, but yeah, that's probably, I think, the best way for it to sit there. What I'm going to do afterward is go over and cover it with glue so it's not moving around, but what I'm going to do is just flip the board over, and I'm going to just bend those like that, kind of hold them in place. So, yeah, it should be fine in this position. I don't think it's going to interfere with the power plug here, because the power plug, I think, latches on around the top there. So that capacitor's proximity to the plug should be fine. I guess we'll find out the end, though, of course. So that was the first of the strange exceptions for this task. What I think we'll do next is pull the large capacitor from the power supply. Alright, so we're taking this large capacitor off there, and these are it's the base of the capacitor, and it kind of concerns me because it doesn't look quite the same as the snap type that it's on the new capacitor. So let's find out if this is going to work or not. I think we're almost done the first one. I suppose this would be a good time for a larger soldering iron tip. Oh, I think we've almost got it, because that's, I think it's actually coming out of its, oh, there we go. Alright, what I'm going to do is, I think the capacitor is, oh, yep, it's pretty much falling out. So if we take a look at the board there, it's not too bad. Got enough of the solder out. And that's where it used to sit. At the bottom of this capacitor, I don't think this is any sign of leakage. It's just like, yeah, it's probably just part of the manufacture process. There's kind of like a residue look to some of that, some of the board there, but I don't think that's anything to worry about. What we're going to do is take a look at our new capacitor. And so if we look at the polarity on the board, it says this one here is the plus, and that one there is the minus. So let's see if I can make these line up. This is not going to go in as is. I think what I need to do is try and carefully bend these legs out a bit. This could be a case of me just ordering the wrong type of capacitor, but I don't know if this old type is even something you can get these days. I mean, it looks fairly close, but yeah, alright, let's take a look now. I think we might be getting there. This is going to be a bit tricky. The spots on the board for the new capacitor are actually almost a little too narrow to fit this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can gently, I don't know, scrape or somehow widen the holes in the board there, and hopefully do that without damaging any of the board. So I'll resume the video when I see what I can do about that. Alright, so I think this should be fine. What I've done is I've kind of, see right in these points in here, what I've done is I've taken a small screwdriver and just kind of twisted it while inside the, right in the spot there, and it's kind of created that rounded part that you can see right in the edge of both those contacts there. And now, if we take the capacitor, and I've kind of tweaked around the legs here to try and get the best fit. So we put the legs right in there. Now it doesn't come through the board all that much, but this is basically as far as the capacitor will go. It's right against the board now. And I think what we can do is just try and bend this leg a bit so that it stays in place. This is kind of difficult. I need to use a good amount of force, but also keep my hand on the capacitor underneath so it doesn't fall back out. I don't think I actually have enough of the leg through there that I can properly bend this into place. Yeah, so I think what I'll need to do is I'll need to kind of manually hold the capacitor in place and then drop some solder on there. And yeah, that should be the way to keep that in place. But before I do that, I might as well just check the fit on the one of these film capacitors here. So what I'm going to do is just remove that one. Alright, I think that should be enough. And no, maybe not. Oh, there we go. That was enough. And the capacitor just fell at the bottom. So, yeah, I don't know, but the age of these types of capacitors, it does concern me a little bit. I don't know how badly these ones will explode when they fail, but the replacement should be a good fit. And there's no polarity on these, so basically just drop in any way you want. And yeah, these ended up being a perfect fit. So just bend these out of the way. And that looks good. So I think what I'll do is I'll finish removing the rest of the capacitors, and then we'll get to soldering them up after. Okay, so the recapping of the power supply seemed to go pretty well. There was a number of capacitors, and it's sometimes it gets pretty dense in here, so trying to actually track what you're doing on the back was something a little bit difficult. But so if we take a look at the large capacitor, I was able to drop a bunch of solder on there. Now, because it is not sitting completely flush with the base, there is a little bit of movement in there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down a bunch of glue around it, because I don't want it moving around and risking any problem with the solder joints. The rest of these capacitors, it was pretty uneventful. Yeah, just standard soldering. I did notice these two capacitors over here, my replacements, are a lot physically smaller than the old ones. The specs were the same that I saw, so I'm hoping that will not be a problem. And yeah, but anyway, what I'll be doing now is take a look at soldering up the analog board. So for the analog board, the recapping of this is fairly straightforward. Most of your capacitors are just pretty much right out in the open. There are a couple of these axial type capacitors right in here. So be aware of when you're installing these to be aware of the polarity of the capacitor. On the actual capacitor, there's going to be an arrow pointing to which side is negative. So you'll need to make sure that lines up with this symbol on the board for, well, positive is what's listed on the board, so you aim the negative away from that, obviously. And also just be aware there is a little capacitor way down in this little cage thing, so you don't want to miss that one there, and then there's a large one there. So I think what we're going to do is probably just lay some solder down on the board to secure these capacitors. Alright, so we're going to start off with, I just use this gel flux, so we'll put a little bit down. And this is a much easier board to work on than the power supply, because it's a lot more open compared to the back of the power supply. There's some spots where it was very tricky to get to. Okay, I think that should probably do the job. So I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and finish the recap and clip all the leads off, and then we'll be set to reassemble this. Alright, so I've got everything reassembled here. Power supply is fully put back together and bolted back to the analog board. And I've already gone through and put a bunch of glue down on a bunch of these capacitors and stuff, so should keep them secure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this back into the SE30 and reconnect all the cables, and we're going to hopefully get a successful test out of it. Okay, so we've got the SE30 reassembled, and I've already got it plugged in. Hasn't been turned on yet. As we're all about safety on Paul's old crap, I do have a fire extinguisher here in case this goes horribly wrong, but let's hope it doesn't. Anyway, we are ready to go. I didn't hear any sound, and something has gone wrong. Alright, well, I managed to solve the problem. Turns out the lines on the screen meant that the ROM sim on the logic board wasn't having proper connectivity, so I basically just pushed it around with my finger a little bit so I didn't have to take the whole board out, and yeah, now the system actually boots up properly. One thing I did notice, though, I don't know if we're going to be able to see it on the screen here. I believe the flyback transformer or whatever is actually on its way out, because I am noticing sometimes I'll have glitches on the display and it'll seem to like move around a bit as if there was a wave going across the screen, or sometimes I'll just have fast glitches show up on the screen there. And this was happening before the recap, and it was one of the things I was hoping the recap would solve. But I think the, yeah, it's like that flyback transformer, I think is what it's called. I think that is going to be requiring replacement. So that'll happen in the future, I guess, though. But anyway, thanks for watching, I guess.